let me add a warm welcome to all of you as well on behalf of the Bangalore International Center. I'm going to add to this introduction what we heard earlier by setting some context, a few words about why we organized this discussion. Obviously, the most obvious reason is that this wonderful collection of essays edited by Peter de Souza has just come out. And this, we thought, provides an excellent opportunity to discuss and reflect on an extraordinary event in our contemporary history. Sadly, this is an event that is rapidly fading from public memory. For anyone under the age of 50 or perhaps 60, this is something that you read about in history books. It is not part of anyone's lived experience anymore. And it's generally seen as a strange period when fundamental rights, including the right to life and liberty, were suspended. Preventive detention measures were used liberally. The news media was subject to censorship, and normal political life, as we know it today, was put into a freezer. Now, this period did not last very long. To general surprise, Indira Gandhi lifted the emergency after 21 months. Prisoners were released, the media was unshackled, and elections were held. The Congress party suffered a stinging defeat, and Indira Gandhi was rather unceremoniously swept from power. Now, this seems a really simple, straightforward story. Democracy was overthrown, elections were held, and the people overthrew those who overthrew democracy, in a sense. But this is really a complex event. And I think it is some of the complexities that we hope to tease out with the wonderful panel that we had. For example, 1977, even when she lost in most parts of the country, Indira Gandhi the Congress retained a presence in South India. So is it because it suffered less? Did it experience the emergency in a different way? 1980, 3 years after losing power, she was swept back into power. And apparently the people whose slums, whose homes were destroyed, who suffered forced sterilization, those who were imprisoned, all of this seemed to have been forgotten and forgiven. So I think this does raise certain fundamental questions about the nature of democracy in India. And these questions, I think, are extremely relevant even today, both in India and globally as well. So this is basically the context of why we decided to have this. And to address these issues, we, of course, have a wonderful set of panelists. And I would like to begin by inviting Peter de Souza, one of the co-editors of this volume, to give us an idea of the thinking behind this collection, and also on one of the chapter that he has authored, which is his analysis of why the emergency was imposed, and more puzzlingly, why it was revoked. I would like then to throw some of the questions that we've been talking about to the panel and get their views before throwing it open to all of you for a general discussion. So thank you. So without further ado, Peter, can I invite you to come up?
Good evening. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Bangalore International Center, for being generous enough to organize a discussion of this book. I actually wear two hats, as an editor and as an author, and I'm not sure which hat should get prominence, but I'll try and do justice to both. When we were invited by the publishers, Orient Black Swan, to do this book, we were hesitant to say yes immediately, because there's a vast literature on the emergency. There are government reports, there are detailed academic studies, there are academic articles. Every political scientist who wanted to be seen as an India hand wrote articles in journals across the world. There were memoirs, there were biographies, there were jail diaries, there were commentaries, there were interviews. There is a huge amount of literature. So we wanted to do something different, and what would that different be? It was a dark period. Let me not for a minute in any way minimize the idea that those 21 months was a dark period, perhaps the darkest. There is an internal debate among us that, should use the word dark, should we not, because as you will see from the discussion. But to me, it was a dark period. You read accounts of torture, of disappearance, of innocent people being picked up, of the jails being filled, of censorship, etc. So it was a dark period. But it was an episode. Now that 50 years have passed, I felt we had enough self-confidence, critical confidence, to be able to return, to revisit that event and see what it's telling us. In a very simple way, why is it a puzzle? With the flip of a switch, democracy was switched off. Emergency was declared. With the flip of a switch, democracy was brought back. Emergency was lifted. Democracy can't be such a trivial and superficial thing. So why did it happen? Parallel with this anxiety, or parallel with this question, were the other things that were sort of the murmurs that, are going around intellectual circles across the world. Then and now is a concern. Here and there is a concern. I'm not going to elaborate on this because I can see it resonates with people. Then and now, here and there. So we wanted to do something different. And we felt that it was important to participate. Even though there's such a vast literature, it was important to participate in revisiting this event because it's an important diagnostic moment, not just for India, but for the disciplines of the social sciences. It's available as a diagnostic moment. You can ask, for example, why was democracy so fragile? Or was democracy very resilient that it came back? You can ask, for example, the exercise of state building in countries coming out of colonialism. Was it that kind of challenge that 1975, after all, India was only a 25-year-old republic, and we were sort of doing rather well, and then the emergency comes. Are there lessons for other democracies, so-called mature democracies? Are we seeing a tension between plebiscitary leaders and political institutions, even those which are well set? So lots of very interesting questions came up, and for us it was an important diagnostic moment. I'm rushing through the reasons why we did the project, and to our good fortune, or we were lucky in that the many people we invited to contribute. We decided it has to be a different kind of book, not a single author book, multiple contributions from multiple perspectives, and we had to have people who, in a sense, like us, were children of the emergency, who had lived through the emergency. If the freedom struggle was the defining moment of our parents' generation, the emergency was an important moment of our generation, where we became political. I moved from chemistry to political science, just to sort of illustrate that point. And we wanted to bring that experience to the young people in the room and to the young people across the country. So we invited people across disciplines, across disciplines and across perspectives. That's important. To contribute, and we imagined themes: literature, law, experience in jail, the JNU experience, any thinkers, Vinoba Bhave, the Shah Commission report. And we actually invited about 20 scholars, of whom 16 delivered. The others worked very hard at trying to deliver it, but personal circumstances, inhibited them from writing their papers. Now you will ask me, okay, why is this different from other volumes? Of the 16 chapters in this book, I would produce 4 clusters of ideas. Okay? The first cluster of ideas was to position the event, position it historically and position it conceptually. Because there were a lot of debates about societies, development debates, societies modernizing, societies developing, etc. How does this event speak to those debates intellectually? We were students in JNU at that time, and this was a literature that was not taken very seriously, but it has something to tell us. So positioning the event historically, positioning it conceptually. The second cluster of ideas is to expand explanations that are already in the public domain. explanations were, the Supreme Court's position, the ADM Jabalpur case, the decisions of other high courts, that time the coercive acts were called MISA. How does that compare to UAPA? So there is a debate ongoing. We expanded it by inviting people to go deeper and take it beyond that. Now, this kind of literature has sort of, again, two groups. There are issues which are already being debated, like, for example, the economic crisis, for example, the foreign hand, for example, the question of huge political protests, and our contributions. Those of you who will look at the book will find that we've expanded the debates. The economic crisis is such an important crisis, never factored in to the reasoning of the emergency. And there are elements that haven't been under-examined, like the role of universities. Like, what happens when somebody goes to jail? Right? Does their citizenship end? Do their rights end? Because we focus on fighting injustice on this side of the steel gates, not on that side of the steel gate. So we have invited. The third cluster of ideas are new dimensions that have not been talked about at all. For example, poetry. For example, there's this wonderful exercise, exchange of letters between Pramila Dandavate and Madhu Dandavate. Madhu Dandavate was in a jail here. Pramila Dandavate was in Pune. Husband and wife, not knowing whether they will be there for how long, were writing letters. She looked out of the jail window, the steel bars, she saw the bird, she saw, very beautiful, very moving. Now, these 200 letters are sitting in the Chicago archives. And the only one who'd seen it is Gyan Prakash, to my knowledge. Others may have seen it. So he said, can you do something? Can you write a piece? He mentions it in his book on the emergency. So we pulled it out and we invited him to write in greater detail. So we have letters. We have the Vinoba Bhave's thought of Anushasan Parva, the role of the dictator. And then, of course, there's a counter perspective that if the emergency was seen by middle-class people like us as denying civil liberties and democratic rights to people, which it was, it may have actually resulted in expanding civil liberties and democratic rights to those who are already oppressed in normal times, Dalits. So, because black marketeers were in jail, money lenders were in jail, bonded people who had bonded labor were in, the 20-point program. And the fourth cluster is my own piece, answering three questions. Why did she impose the emergency? What happened during the emergency? And why did she lift the emergency? Now, the second question, what happened during the emergency, has been extensively discussed. All that literature, they talked about violence, incarceration, censorship, etc. That has been discussed. So I thought I would answer question 1 and question 3. Okay? Now, if you ask each of these questions, why did she impose it? Why did she lift it? If you ask it separately, why did she impose it? Then you will say, Allahabad High Court case, she wanted to save her chair. You will give one set of answers. Why did she lift it? You will come up with the standard answer that, the intelligence agencies told her she'll win the election. So if you ask the questions together, that means you can't answer these two questions without connecting them. You can't offer these. This is my thing. You can't offer these justifications or these explanations. So I try and ask the two questions together. And my essay is basically an attempt to answer that question. How many more minutes now? Okay. Now, I have attempted, in a sense, speaking to my community of social scientists, I'm saying that because I know many of you are academics, to suggest that there is a dimension of explanation that has often been ignored or underplayed. The dimension, trying to understand such a decision, why did she lift, why did she impose, by opening up the subjective world of which influenced her decision making. Why am I so excited about the Prime Minister making these decisions? Because Prime Ministers are important. Decisions they make, as you know, affect all of us. Not just here, even presidents are important. So the decisions that people in the highest centers of power take have huge impacts on people's lives. So what prompted her decision? I said I wanted to bring the subjective back in. And I thought the way to do that is to, in a sense, construct what I will call a decision frame. So it's not a psychologistic argument. Psychologistic is part of the argument, it's part of the decision frame, but it's also looking at meaning systems. It's trying to understand how Indira Gandhi in 1975, 5 years after the Bangladesh war, feted as Durga by the people, suddenly feels that she must impose emergency. So I constructed a decision frame based on the material available. We have not seen her private papers. These are not available. The files not available. So this is largely through memoirs, through biographies, some of them official biographies. One has actually built up the story. And I say, if you try and construct a decision frame, there are external elements. That means she saw the world in a certain way. She saw these things are important and I've got to do something about it. And there were internal elements that said, I'm the only one who can do something about it. Okay. Economic crisis. Prime Minister, there were 2 failed monsoons. There was a 1973 oil shock where the price of oil went up 5 times. There was a railway strike of 20 days where George Fernandez, who was leading the strike, said, I will bring the economy to its knees. There was huge unemployment and inflation, and my economist friends say it hasn't been as high in the period of independent India till that year, 17%. I'm not an economist, so I can't give you. Vinod perhaps can respond to that. There were sanctions because of the nuclear explosion. So the economy was in severe crisis, and not just in terms of food scarcity and food availability, but in terms of not being able to meet foreign, because the cost and the price of oil meant her foreign exchange reserves had almost disappeared. One external element. Second external element, the foreign hand. Now it sounds like, things that prime ministers use to justify their continuation. Oh, I'm under threat. But her advisors, particularly her intelligence agents, were telling her Allende had been assassinated. Ellen Mishra had been assassinated. And friends of India like Castro were telling her, Madam, you're next. And the foreign hand is not a naive thing. It's not just rhetoric. It is, serious students of international politics like Jeffrey Sachs, writing in 2025, has said there have been 96 attempts by the US government at regime change. So these are people who've looked at certain archives to make this point. So I think that's something we must consider. She certainly considered seriously. There was a huge escalation of political protest. The politics of the street replaced the politics of parliament. Gujarat, Bihar, and it was spreading across the country. The archives tell you that chief ministers were writing saying, we can't handle this escalating protest. Within her own party, this is now a party that had been formed with her as the supreme leader. It had split from the Congress organization. She had produced a 2/3 or a huge majority in the 71 elections. Within her party, people were conspiring to replace her. People like Jagjeevan Ram, people like Chandrasekhar, people like Mohan Daria. So she couldn't trust even her own party. They were not going to, in this crisis, they were not available to her. And court judgments. So there were at least 5 or 6 external elements that emerged as part of her decision frame. Now come to internal elements. I'll finish in 2 minutes, okay? She was a lonely personality. As a child, she grew up in a world where there were really no friends. She had to keep moving and leaving schools because her mother was dying of tuberculosis. And Nehru was in jail. For 9 years of the freedom movement, Nehru was in jail. And she was nursing her mother, whether in Switzerland or France or Pune or Pasuri, right across the country. So this was her life. So she didn't trust anybody. And yet at the same time, Nehru was writing her letters from jail. Discovery, you must know that if Darwin's theory is accepted, then religion will never be the same. So he's educating her about the ideas of the time. So I don't know what kind of relationship she developed. Did she dislike Nehru that he chose jail over family? Because the British told him, we are willing to withdraw all charges, give up politics, look after your family. He chooses politics over family. She was also very obstinate. In the biography, there are accounts of her, Nehru and Gandhi and telling her, don't marry Feroz Gandhi. She says, I'm going to marry. So she actually goes. There's a kind of obstinacy. There are many cases, including, the explosion of the nuclear bomb. Her advisor telling her, don't, because we're going to face sanctions. We cannot afford it. She says, go ahead. And when the US 7th Fleet comes into the Bay of Bengal, the Indian Navy is blockading Chittagong. They're not in a position to, she says, just go ahead. So there's a kind of obstinacy, perhaps courage. And then importantly, her moral and intellectual influences are Nehru, Gandhi, Tagore. So somebody with this sort of, if we take our theory seriously, that you are the product of your context, of your socialization, then this is a socialization. Where is that authoritarian personality that is so central to coming from? And then on the same day as the adverse Allahabad High Court judgment, she learns of the death of one of her closest friends, D.P. Dhar. So I see all this as producing a person with a sense of siege. There's nobody she can trust. The nation is in crisis, and she thinks she's the only one who can deal with the crisis. Now, you may read what I'm saying as a kind of justification. It is not a justification. It's an attempt to expand and deepen the explanation. We'll argue about that. But she had a certain narcissism that only she could solve the problem. She couldn't, when she actually, there was a resignation letter signed, but she typed out, but not signed. And then she took it back and she decided to impose emergency. So my explanation is, why did she impose it? Why? I'm really rushing through a more complex argument, but I want to give you the sort of punchline. She decided to impose it because the two personas that made up her personality were the daughter of Nehru. I'm using a coded short form, the daughter of Nehru and the mother of Sanjay. From the daughter of Nehru, she got all these high ideals of free India, parliamentary democracy, constitutional things. She should have resigned. From Sanjay, the mother of Sanjay, he was under attack. He was a bit of a crook. He was using strong arm tactics to deal with politics. But she was the only one she trusted because everybody else was not available. How does she reconcile these two? Now, Siddharth Shankare gave her a solution. She imposed it. 352 madam is available. You can do it constitutionally. So unlike other authoritarians, she didn't reject the constitution. She did it and she reconciled mother and daughter. I'm using these as code words, but I know if you take the idea of the subjective seriously, then all of us know how we have to deal with parents, children, etc. I suppose in ethical theory, you're most generous to the faults of your children. You're not going to phone up the police and say, my son, violated a traffic light or banged into my neighbor's car. So these two personalities are in struggle. Imposing it allowed her to align. Then the reports of the excesses of the emergency, the huge atrocities of the emergency, particularly because of Sanjay, in this 5-point program, started becoming available in her internal reports. And P.N. Dhar talks about this. So in the imposition of the emergency, all the advisors, Siddharth Shankare, Sanjay, Bansi Lal, etc., tell her, madam, impose the emergency, we'll deal with the politics. To lift it, she doesn't consult any of them. All of them are surprised. She not only, because she realizes now these two personalities cannot be reconciled, and she chooses the daughter over the mother. This is my, in coded form, this seems like a very superficial understanding, but I want you to enter these subjective universes, reflect on your own lives and see how important they are when we make decisions. So she lifted it without consulting her advisors. They were surprised. And not only did she lift it, she opened the electoral field without restrictions. Even the opposition, JP&L, was surprised. There were no restrictions. They could go around campaigning. Media was unshackled. And they thrashed her in the 1970s. She knew she was going to lose. She says this to Pupul Jaikar. At least it's mentioned in the biography. So, in the second case of why she lifted it, the two personalities could not be reconciled. And in my understanding, it was the daughter of Nehru was the one that gained. Now, please do not see this, argue with it as an attempt. It is not. It is an attempt to invite you to engage with the subjective material that is out there, but often ignored. And in my engagement, this is how I've constructed the argument. I may be wrong. There could have been other options available to us, as I've learned from my dear friends in informal conversations. She could have resigned and handed it to Jagjeevan Ram. She could have resigned and given it to YB Chavan. But she thought the nation is falling apart. Nations across the world are falling apart. There is anarchy staring us in the face. And I'm the only one who can resist that. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was a wonderful tour de force. I must say, personally, we've been talking about this for the last 2 days since we're very old friends. But it was a brilliant exposition. If I may be, if I may say, the whole explanation of what was it, Mama Jekyll. daughter Hyde. No, Mama Hyde and daughter Jekyll. And I think that really is an excellent way to go about this. So thank you very much. So what I'm going to do now is really, we've got an excellent panel here, each of whom have read and engaged with the book. And I would like to ask each one of you really to talk a little bit about what you have taken from the book. And Janaki, if I may.
First of all, thank you very much, Thomas Abraham, for inviting me to this panel. Thank you, Peter, for putting together a book that has been so thought-provoking. I strongly recommend that all of you who have not read it so far do go through it. As someone who has taught on contemporary India, and as someone who, as you have pointed out, would like to remind our young very urgently in our times about this dark chapter in our post-independence history, I read this book with obvious interest and some pleasure as well. I'm going to be really quick because we have several panelists, but I do want to say that every time I have taught about the emergency, I begin by actually playing that announcement, which by the way now is available on Prasar Bharati website, I think, in which you hear this very faltering voice declaring the emergency. It's not a confident, it's in fact read out, the statement, and it sounds like she's reading it for the first time. But I think the question that I would like to ask you, Peter, is do we see the emergency as a symptom or as a solution to the political crisis? Is it a symptom of a political crisis or was it a solution? Because if I can just list out, and these are some things which are taken from the book as well, the kinds of achievements that were made in this period. Indira Gandhi promised everything to everyone. So if I can just list out industrial discipline to the bourgeoisie, lower prices to the middle classes, abolition of poverty to the poor, and of course, the country's integrity to all. And so you get actually something for everyone. That's part of this 20-point program. I'm going to come to the question of Karnataka in just towards the end. So in this book, what I took away mainly are the, some things obviously are very familiar to those of us who've been teaching this post-independence history. But in this book, we got unusual perspectives on visions of a post-authoritarian future. The anti-political future, that was a very fascinating chapter for me, Tridib Surud's chapter on Vinoba Bhave, and his anti-political stand. Again, as I say, a very unusual chapter which you should read. I can't go into the details here, but there is also this imagination that there can be partyless politics. There is a politics of freedom that's not linked to parties, as in the exchange, this very tender but also revealing politically this exchange between Pramila Dandavati and Madhu Dandavati. An idea, especially in the writing of Pramila Dandavati, of a morality that is delinked from religion, the possibility of a morality delinked from religion, and her hope of what she sees as nothing less than a cultural revolution as a necessity to secure democracy in India. Now, this is something that has not happened, and of course we can debate why it has not happened. But the interesting thing is, and I think this is again demonstrated clearly by your book, that no attempt, despite this experience, despite the analyses, despite the shock and people's recognition that this was really something that needed to be prepared for in the future, we have to admit, given the times we inhabit today, the undeclared emergency, as Arvind Narayan's brilliant book puts it, that no attempt was made in these intervening 50 years to deepen democratic roots. Democracy has remained topsoil, which, what did he call it? Topsoil or top dressing? Ambedkar. We have not strengthened these democratic roots, and that is why, to some extent, we are yielding up, as it were, our freedoms so easily, even today. The state remains unaccountable. We have seen, for example, that the Right to Information Act has now become the right to deny information. Increasingly, the Indian people are asked to provide the KYC, know your customer, but it's actually a sort of punishing kind of exposure to the state that we are constantly asked to provide, while the state is becoming more and more opaque to us. It refuses us information. It refuses any kind of accountability. I'm coming to the chapter that Peter wrote because I thought it was unusual, very fascinating, and thank you, Peter, for actually spending time discussing it, because I don't think anything like this really exists in the emergency literature. So thank you for closing on that note. And despite what you say, I think it is actually an understanding of Indira in this, in terms of the psychic constitution of a dictator. That you've been kind to her, or whether you've not been kind is a different matter, but it is looking at the psychic constitution. But I want to say that really speaking, the need of our hour, and I really thank, again, Thomas, for allowing me to speak here, because I think the need of our hour is to understand the mass psychology of fascism. We need to know what it is about the Indian people that makes them love and enjoy their subjection. And this perpetuation of obedience, we saw it when the talis were banged during Corona. We saw it, we were tested, right? Where are we going to be the obedient people? And we were. So, we need to ask ourselves, I'm saying this because one of the most important political scientists who has also written in the emergency, Sudipto Kaviraj, has actually talked about the emergency as a time of medieval psychophancy. And it was chilling for me because I didn't think that Sudipto Kaviraj, who is a Marxist, a very sensitive Marxist, would use words like medieval psychophancy, but somewhere he is suggesting that there is some ingrained DNA that refuses democracy in all its forms. And we need to ask ourselves why this is so. That, we are, the nation was not a composite entity, but a collective individual, as we say. We're again playing this out even today. I want to, however, suggest something which perhaps is not so much in the book. And I would have liked to see some consolidation of this in some writing. It's there in scattered writings, and that is some of the unwittingly positive outcomes of the emergency. Some people have written this. For example, it was in 1974 and then finally in 1975 that the Towards Equality report actually came out, which was the founding document of the women's movement and also of women's, academy, that is to say, women's studies in India. So that's a very significant timing that this is happening at this time. And we are grateful, very extremely grateful to the writers of that report in the mid-1970s. We have in a footnote in which Kalpana Kannabiran cites Upendra Bakshi, a reference to the fact that we have this very, very robust human rights organizations emerging in this time. We have the public interest litigation emerging in this time. This was made possible by conditions of oppression. So, I'm not saying that therefore we need to be oppressed, but I'm just saying that we need to mark some of the ways in which the pushback has actually happened. But we also see the emergency as a turning point, I believe, and I think this is a very important thing for us to understand in the trajectory of post-independence India. It was the turning point when earlier mobilizational categories such as student, worker, peasant, etc., were not able to be mobilizational categories exactly in the post-75 period. Of course, since FTII strike in 2016 and then the HCU events of 2017, the JNU events of 2016 and so on, and then of course Jadavpur, there was a strong wave of student strikes and resistance, as it were, to the emerging conditions which were an attack on the academy and on the university. But I don't think the student as a mobilizational category, as it might have been in the 1960s and 70s, anymore prevails. So, and the worker, the peasant. So 74 railway strike has been mentioned in some detail by you. And that was indeed a moment which was, very, very important, a turning point, etc. So we have instead, since 75, new social movements and new people's movements, which are addressed to questions of environment, which are addressed to questions of rights, and so on and so forth. You have also the emergency being the turning point which allows the rise of the Hindu right, and in particular the parties that actually represent the Hindu right. They were able to wash off the stains of Gandhi's assassination. They had been in the boondocks, as it were, as a consequence of Gandhi's assassination, but they were able to wash that off. I'm going to come last, to the question of Karnataka, because this was raised, Thomas, by you, and I want to say a few things about this, which is that Karnataka, he is right, that, there were some ways in which Devarajars actually softened the impact of the emergency in a state like Karnataka. He was very active in implementing the 20-point program, but not Sanjay's 5-point program. That was one important difference. The other was that I was speaking to Chiranjeev Singh some months ago, and he was telling me that as the person who was in charge of, the censorship and so on and so forth, they received the notification from Delhi that the Indian Express has to be held back till 3 p.m., which means that basically the newspaper could not go to print in quite the same form that it is if it had been held back. And he goes to Urs and says, this is clearly illegal, and I've been told that this is illegal. I mean, an illegality of the state was being called out. And Urs said, if it is illegal, we should not follow it. So they did release the paper by 12 noon, as was expected for the production of the paper. So there were some ways in which there are people who have argued, and Peter, you can perhaps bear me out on this, that the family planning figures which were demanded by the union government were actually forged in states like Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka in order to meet those targets, that they weren't actually performed, but they were nevertheless reported. So Urs definitely, whether there is truth to that, is something that I have not able to establish. There may be others in the audience who can say something more about this. Urs saved Karnataka from the worst excesses of emergency. There is no question about that, and that explains to some extent why Congress remained a presence here. But importantly, throughout the emergency, there were no boots on the ground. The people who were blamed for some of the excesses were bureaucrats, were low-level officials who were taking their commitment to their leader to great extents. It was not the kind of vigilantism that we are seeing today, the empowerment of people to intervene in lives, in marriage, in food, in dress, and so on, with impunity. We did not have anything resembling this kind of interference during the period of the emergency. And one last thing I want to say about the emergency period in Karnataka, and it may not be accident. This was the decade, and it was 1975, January actually, that the Dalit Sangharsh Samiti was registered, established, became one of the most important cultural and political forces of Karnataka in the period of the 1970s. We don't have a good account of how Dalits in Karnataka actually analyzed and saw what had happened during the emergency. But I was, if I can be autobiographical here, I accompanied Samudaya, which was one of the most important theatre groups of the early 1980s, on their jatas. And they had actually put together plays which talked about repression in the time of Indira Gandhi. And they were extremely well received wherever we went. But in terms of including the Dalit perspective, that had still not happened in the official left. We can talk about that maybe if there's a question. Last point, and this is, I think, again, something which is not in the volume and needs to be emphasized. As we know, there's a lot of comment and discussion about the fact that two words were introduced in the preamble, socialism and secularism, during the emergency. It was at the height of the emergency that these two terms were, and that it's therefore not in the original, therefore it has to be expelled, and so on and so forth. What perhaps is less known is that actually the chapter on fundamental duties was also introduced by Swaran Singh during the emergency. Now, the fundamental duties, as Parthu Chatterjee has pointed out, is a contradiction in terms. You cannot have a contract between a citizen and a state that is sort of, exchanging rights for duties. This can happen only in authoritarian regimes, that you establish fundamental duties as part of the constitution. And you can see that that's the part that our current regime loves the most. They want to keep fundamental duties as part of all textbooks. It's there in our newly revised NCERT textbooks. And this idea that regimes can impose duties in exchange for rights is itself, as I say, something that's only possible in, under authoritarianism. So, and move to authoritarian rule.
Thank you very much, Janaki. You did take long, but every minute, every second was worth it. So thank you for that. A few months ago, you delivered a masterclass on modern Karnataka history. I think we have another masterclass here in the making. So thank you very much. You've raised a whole number of issues, solution, symptom. You have drawn lines. I don't know whether if it's in a linear fashion or not, between what happened then and what has happened now. So we will come back to all of that. But before that, I would like to ask Chandan Gowda for his reflections on the book.
The book that Peter and Harsh Sethi put together go a long distance, actually, in restoring some kind of a properness to how we understand emergency, with a variety of vantage points from which you try to get at it. Just to add another incident from Karnataka, to complicate his use of the term dark. P. Lankesh's first film, he's a Kannada writer, Pallavi, the first day of the shoot was the day on which the emergency was declared. He describes it in his autobiography. The country is going in one direction and I was headed in another direction. The film gets completed, goes to Bombay to get it edited by Hrishikesh Mukherjee, gets the best film on national award. Shivram Karant was returned the Padma Bhushan because of the emergency. He's actually strangely on the award selection committee. He gives the best director award to him, etc., etc. So this is not to say on the one hand or the other hand situation, but there is an extremely complex situation. I don't think this can be seen as free of tensions all around, but lots of things are happening. So Chiranjeev Singh commissions two travelogues, one by Arkinar and one by Dom Moraes, in the middle of the emergency. And Dom Moraes is having conversations with the big artists and writers of the state, also sneaks in appreciative remarks on how the state is doing on the birth control side. And the land reforms is something, of course, he does. At that time, Kalpana Karnabiran also for the Andhra side says there's this IAS officer called Shankaran who did a lot of excellent work in terms of implementing social welfare programs. So it's a complex period. Very quickly, the subtitle of the book is Lessons for Democracy. So it's a little like, what does history tell the future, sort of an angle. And if we were to simply focus on the middle class as an actor, Gopal Guru, in his essay in the book, says the middle class was reactive in its response. It managed to get worked up because of the sudden imposition of the emergency. And too many things were happening at the same time. It seemed like a serious encroachment of their freedoms. And they did not protest out of any deep sense of historical, the mature understanding of freedom. And if you took that now, because if we are indeed in a state of undeclared emergency, as so many people are claiming it is, and we don't know quite when to start this period of undeclared emergency, because the laws that are mimicking the Maintenance of Internal Security Act have been in place for a very long time. So my sense, being part of the middle class and having moved through the middle class, is that the middle class has absorbed a lot of the nice freedoms that the Constitution gives them without being able to tell the source or have a clear sense of what is giving them all of that. Because when you say the Constitution is in danger, it's an indifferent shrug. And people getting worked up are those who are seeing it as a removal of reservations. Also, another strange predicament, if you think about it, it's not that it's a guarantor of freedoms as much as a guarantor of kind of social protection benefits. And this, Peter, is happening with an additional dynamic today, which I think was absent in the mid-70s, that one could say the crisis of representative democracy for the last 25 years. That's independent of the subversion of democracy attempts by any political party. The way elections have come to be what they've become, and where winnability is used in an extremely commonsensical fashion, the choice of candidates. And so there's already something strange has happened to this notion of democracy. If you want to say the legitimacy of democracy has come under some kind of a deep skepticism, and people are going through the motion of elections, etc. But is there a faith in the electoral system as a representative system? An over-centralized system where decisions seem to be taken like that, hundreds of decisions by the day, all of them affecting you in some fundamental way, but you don't quite know where you come in. And decentralization is just not part of this, whatever 73rd or 74th amendments, they've just been quickly reined in. And this thing of trying to, if democracy is being subverted by an elected government, what are your sources of defense? You have political parties that do believe in the Constitution, will try to fight for it. Of course, the official class in the judiciary could fight for it, but we know how that relationship has been realigned. The separation of powers, checks and balances seems like a fairy tale promise. I don't know if it ever worked in practice, but anyway, it's come unravel totally. And civil society organizations, of course, are committed to democracy fight. But the real big guarantor of this are the robust democratic norms among the citizens. And here, again, it's a very complex picture. How many people's self-understanding is informed by themselves as members of a democratic polity is a question to ask. And I think this has become even more complicated in a time of extreme polarization, where your sense of objective reasoning is really taken second place to your attachment to your party, where you give them the longest leash in violating anything and everything, as long as you still think they are your party. And I think this is a peculiar predicament that we are confronted with, and all the talk of civil liberties for the last how many ever decades, however important it may be, is just not clicking. Community rights continue to matter. When Rahul Gandhi says scarce census, he's really talking about community rights. People resonate. The Hindu Rashtra is a community right kind of an angle. So the community as a reference point for even the discussion of rights seems to go a long way. Not individual rights. I don't know why. I mean, think of all the people who've been put into prison unfairly, etc. Are passions running high on their behalf? No, but if a community head is put into jail, we know how many of them have been put into jail, then immediately there's a groundswell of support. So I know, and I don't mean this as an ethnographic observation just to be, but what does it mean for the politics of democratic norms building, even around the Constitution? That's a question I would like us to ask, and I think it comes out of many of the things that we find in Peter's book. There'll be an occasion to revisit them later, so I'll stop. But thank you, Peter and Harsh.
Thank you, Chandan, for those comments. You've actually added several really interesting and I think rich themes for discussion, including the way the practice of elections, electoral democracy. And I think some of what you said also has echoes of what Janaki was saying about the mass psychosis of fascism, in a different degree. So thank you. There's just so much coming out of this discussion that Rinku, let me move on to you. And this is already becoming a huge feast. So
thanks, Thomas, for bringing us all together. This is the book that we're discussing, 50 Years of the Indian Emergency, Lessons for Democracy, edited by Peter Ronald de Souza and Harsh Sethi, published by Orient Black Swan. I found this volume really rich in terms of the subtitle again, Lessons for Democracy. And I'm going to say a few things that I was prompted to think about when I read the subtitle and I wondered, okay, what are we looking at the emergency for? Lessons for democracy, but what is democracy? And that's the question. If I have to ask Peter a question, it would be this: which would be the core values that constitute a democratic commitment? I'm going to try and answer the question myself as well. So the burden is mine too, because I don't think democracy is something that is trying to sell itself to us. As Chandan said, we have to ask whether we are a people that have an interest in democracy. So I think the world out there is a world of conflict. It's a world out there which is filled with power imbalances. And we can decide that we would like the arrangement to look autocratic, we would like the arrangement to look authoritarian, or we choose the democratic commitment. These are different ways of arranging power. Each of them is artificial. None of them comes naturally. Soil is a good thing to think about, but we cannot add soil where it doesn't. I mean, I don't know if you can grow things except horticulture, hybrid, maybe something. I don't know. But the question we're asking ourselves is lessons for democracy from the Indian emergency. The first lesson is actually a restatement or a clarification, I think, that what does it mean to say that we want a lesson for democracy? I'm thinking, what does democracy require? Or if I want to be committed to democracy, what must I be cautious of? Right? So democracy, many, and this is a subject that's occupied people for centuries. What is democracy? Demos and kratos, power to the people to do things together. Power to the people to do things together collectively for the collective good, which is not known in advance, which is found out by the heterogeneous collectivity. And very important in this heterogeneous collectivity's attempt to figure out what it wants to do with each other is that each one there has some interest. Each one has some, those interests are sometimes rightized. They become our rights. If we have some vital interests, we have some interests in having this kind of society out there rather than this. I'd rather be in an authoritarian arrangement than in a democratic arrangement. I'd rather patriarchy. I'd rather a caste order. These are reducible to interests that we have. Interests that can be reshaped, no doubt. Interests that may become stubbornly ideological, but interests matter. And eventually, democracy, if it's power of the people to do things together, keeping in mind issues that should be seen as matters of common concern, then we reshape our interests, but our interests matter. People and their interests matter in a very significant way. Democracy, again, scholars for the last many centuries and repeatedly in the last decades have been telling us, is something that should be understood systemically. It's not enough for having elections, an electoral system, representative form of government. That's not democracy. Democracy is more demanding. A lesson for democracy is to see what happens when we are not demanding a few things or when we don't yield to some of the demands that we may want if we choose the democratic instead of the authoritarian or the autocratic order for arranging power, for distributing, for acting with each other, over each other, etc. So coming back to this question of interests, ordinary people, and in modern times, ordinary people matter equally. Ordinary people have an interest in being able to form their interests freely. Ordinary people have an interest in being able to form their interests freely in private and in public. right? So the emergency, the book tells us, why I find this volume rich is because it's a very interesting collection of essays that lets us look at the demands of democracy at the personal level, at the institutional level, at the level of public sphere, which is a space where privatized individuals come together. They can come together as groups. There's nothing wrong in having a community orientation. A lot of our lives, in ways that we've been marginalized, is group structured. So community identity can be relevant for understanding or even asserting freedom, right? So freedom to form my interests. Do I have a regime that supports that freedom? Does it give me spaces that are private in which I can develop those interests, which may be antagonistic, may not even be politically correct, but am I free to do that? Times like the emergency actually attack those possibilities systemically, right? Interest formation, difficult. I don't even have access to information because there's censorship. There's a disorientation out there. I'm not allowed to think. I'm not allowed to speak. I'm not allowed to walk in groups. I'm not allowed to associate. The distinction between democratic rights and civil liberties can sometimes meld, because to be a person who can exercise democratic rights, I need to have had some other liberties too. And the emergency was a moment when all of these ordinary things that we think should be there, if we're interested in a democratic way of sharing power with each other, those were taken away. So again, coming back more systematically to the volume itself, there are chapters which look at the way in which institutions faltered, the judiciary played a role in undermining the possibility of sharing power within the polity in a democratic rather than authoritarian manner, separation of powers not followed. These are not natural things. Again, democracy requires effort all the time. It's artificial, we produce it, we choose it. And we choose it sometimes out of convenience, but we let it go as well as a matter of convenience. Tocqueville taught us that. There's also this Pew thing, right? Pew Center, Pew, PEW, which has told us that Indians are not interested in democratic forms of governance. There's a kind of fondness for authoritarian regimes and strong leadership. I'm going to jump a little bit. Leadership matters even in the democratic commitment. And I think Peter's chapter on Indira Gandhi is a little bit about the moral psychology of a leader, that we need to perhaps pay attention to what happens with our representatives. We have to pay some it, and I don't think it's, I don't know, I don't see this as a psycho, I can't remember the word, but of a dictator. Any leader, I don't know if she was a dictator, but I mean, and I don't know why she gave up her dictatorial authority, etc. She was an authoritarian at that time. But the question that's relevant as a lesson for democracies, we better pay attention to what our leaders are up to in their public roles. Leaders are not the antithesis of a democratic system, because we cannot do without representation if we choose to be democratic, simply because direct participation doesn't work till the end to make decisions as well. So democracy is about interests that are somewhere tracked in decision making, because of which we have to have an interest in the political parties that throw up candidates for us to think about with respect to our interests and so on and so forth. So once again, democracy, systemic, demanding. Chapters in this essay let us know how institutional frameworks faltered, and they allowed an intrusion or an erosion of those vital spaces in private and public through which citizens can form and express and reshape their interests. There is an interesting chapter, which is chapter 4. I'm going chronologically and less in a cluster thematic way, but it's an important chapter which is on the Shah Commission reports. Emergency powers are not unusual for liberal democracies as long as the emergency power is used to maintain what the liberal democracy was supposed to deliver. This is the view of some people on emergency powers. They're not always seen as states of exception. These are not powers that put the users of those power beyond the pale of accountability if we function within liberal democratic arrangements for distributing power. So on that count, something like the Shah Commission report should have been taken much more seriously by us, by the memory that's forgotten about it, because we're asking, how was anyone accountable for what they did? Of course, we had an amendment which took away one possibility for emergencies to be imposed. Internal disturbance no longer remains a ground. But for those who were, this was a bit like a truth commission in some ways, the Shah Commission, or an inquiry committee with some kind of powers to summon, but I don't know what enforcement powers it has in the chapter, the chapter is important because it's shedding light on the way in which a democracy, lessons for democracy, if we have to retain these things called emergency powers to secure this territory, indeed in some way, so that ordinary persons can continue to lead some kind of civil existence, then what would those look like? And the Shah Commission was appointed to ask questions about the way in which power was used, but we don't recall it. And this is coming back then to the question of democracy depends on people. The democratic commitment depends on us folks, individuals, which as Chandan has well said, we don't seem to be showing any proclivities for it. So with us sitting and bemoaning it's going away and oh, how sad authoritarianism has come up, and some of us more speedy in trying to protect ourselves from authoritarianism, others a little bit more lackadaisical. Why does that happen? This book has some interesting answers for those kinds of questions as well. Why did tyrannical use of power by bureaucrats get authorized? Right? How was it possible and this is continuing in some way what Chandan said, even though it might be something different. So I'm not saying I'm going to attribute this to you. But you said this was a time when it's not possible to say that X acted in a linear, systematic way and spoke against the emergency all the time. The chapter by Pamela Philippos on the way in which censorship was imposed on journalists, on the press, on print media, actually brings us out very well. There's no time to read out. I wish I could read out. But there were dilemmas. People who said, oh, this emergency is terrible and it's censorship and we must speak against it. Khushwant Singh, for example, within 3 months was towing a different line. So there's no blame apportioned, but the time is a rather troubling one for someone who may want to take democracy seriously, because people were riven. They didn't know they didn't know which side they would last longer. Fathers were writing to their sons saying that I'd like to meet with you and keep things safe for you, but my self-respect is important. Madhu Dandavate is writing to Pramila Dandavate and saying, I wish we could meet, but not in a situation where we meet as cowards. Ordinary persons may want self-respect and the ability to live with bravery, which democratic times may be able to afford a bit more to us than autocratic and authoritarian times. But that's a choice we have to make. The lesson here in these chapters, I think, is not just about the limits to private space and public sphere participation, but to the way in which selves get driven as well in times where you don't know what you can do or cannot do. I don't know if this strikes a chord with the way in which we experience our lives today. That is for us to judge. But democracy if we want democracy, we'd have to ask what kinds of person what kind of disposition does the democratic citizen have to have? We may not be interested in it, but the emergency tells us it seems like if you want to lead your lives ordinarily, you want to be a person who wants to form your interests in an oriented manner with information flowing in a way that's not fake or suppressed. What do you need? And what do democratic arrangements give you? This book has some interesting things to say there. There are some lovely chapters on the place of poetry and prophecy. And, so poetry during emergency, why do I say this is a lovely chapter? I think it's a lovely chapter because for me, I take democracy seriously. Maybe it was apparent to you already. I don't think it's natural. I think it's very difficult because we are given to hierarchy everywhere in the world. Human beings love differentiating. They love creating hierarchies and making differences. And we have to battle against that tendency. Very few people are naturally democratic. They exist, but they are not many in number, or else we may have had a different kind of world, I suppose. So this chapter on poetry and prophecy is I found it very interesting because it's letting us think about what does democracy require of the ordinary person? The space to imagine. And poetry gives that. And there's some very nice lines there. And she's quoting Shelley to say that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And that's interesting. It's so because the language of poetry is a form of persuasion through which you can actually hit without hurting, right? And you can hit, nevertheless. So the space during the emergency, not for that, but how there were responses in spite of censorship through these modes of expression is well brought out there, and the necessity of it as well, to just be persons. The last thing I want to say, and I will just then come back and take my seat there, is something else. So there was a lot of restriction. Pamela Philippo's chapter lets us experience the censorship and the dithering on the part of prominent journalists, this side or that side, closing shop or keeping it open, and then blank editorials or the use of cyclo-styled material to avoid censorship. So all of that shows that there are always possibilities, even when things seem repressive, if you want to change the arrangement of power. And the thing that you may have to do for that may not look like everyone has to be doing it in the same way. There will be a variety of ways in which you can respond back to assert. There can be. So I think the chapter on the students' movement in JNU, but Philippo's explanation of what the JNU students were doing with the cyclo-style material, as well as the different forms through which different newspapers and journals and magazines expressed through cartoons that were interesting. Cartoon is that one, right? This is an obituary to DEM by T. Ruth, right?
L.I. Bhatti.
Yes, and L.I. Bhatti. So this was like an obituary to democracy by the truth and for the demise of liberty. So interesting ways in which there was and I think even the chapter on poetry recalls the same example to say that there are possibilities even when things look rather dim. That's another lesson, I think, for democracy. So institutions matter. We cannot have democracy and decision-making that's democratic without institutions, without leaders. But those leaders, we have to think about them carefully. Role morality of the prime minister or the president or anyone who's exercising power. Are they accountable? And are we asking for accountability? Or are we just so interested in what does democracy require? What lessons do we have? But we are fond of something else. That's the question I think the book also lets us ask. It's a really nice volume. Do get a hold of it. And it lets you think, I think, about democracy in its different dimensions and its demandingness. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Rinku, for that wonderful tour de force. And I think what I took away from what you were saying is really democracy is hard work, and it's hard work that is impendent on not just on institutions, but on each one of us as individuals. So what I would like to do now is give Peter about 5 minutes to respond. I know that many of you will have questions, and you really are the panelist that is out there. And I do want to bring you into this as well. But I would like to give Peter time to respond to these wonderful, sort of responses to his book.
So it's very nice of Tom to sort of give me an opportunity. I don't think I can respond. I can just join the conversation because I saw the three panelists as both being critical and being appreciative, and a lot of what they said I agree with. So it's not like I have to defend the book. The book had one objective: to generate a public debate. If this is the beginning of a public debate, then I can go back and sleep well tonight. But I would like to think about some of the things that they have said. As I said, I agree with almost everything that was suggested. I see these as pointers of further research and further discussion. If at all I have to begin with thinking, trying to bring together all the comments and observations made, there are two opening statements I would make. The first is from Ambedkar, and not because Ambedkar has gained so much in publicity, but I like this line with which he's presenting the draft constitution to the Constituent Assembly. He says, we now will enter a world of contradictions. And that word contradictions is something that has just grown bigger and bigger in my mind as I look at different democratic episodes. And I think all three panelists, in a sense, point out to those contradictions. I think democracy in India has entered a world of contradictions. and is spending a lot of time renegotiating these contradictions, some of which we have tried to present to you today. The second statement that I would like to sort of have a sort of an entry point for my conversation comes from Kalpana. She says, and especially when you talk about, how did Karnataka respond? She says, if at all we need to take this discussion forward, we need to build local histories of the emergency, because the emergency did not have one story right across the country. I think that is important. I think we need, if there are young scholars over here, we need to build local histories of the emergency. Now, having said that, I really want to dwell on just two ideas that require further discussion. One is the one that Rinku presented so elegantly. The idea that democracy is all about arranging power. And if these contradictions are about different suggestions about how to arrange power, then that is really what we need to think about. If democracy is about arranging power, and if I may add to that idea of arranging power in such a way that there is a popular control of power, that there is a popular control of power by people who are now beginning to accept and internalize their political equality. So these are the two. You asked what are the values? These are how the popular control and political equality are the basis for the arrangement of power. And she has suggested that this exercise of popular control is a continuous exercise, and I agree with that. Now, having said that, I really cannot take longer than that because we really want to have a conversation. The suggestion by Janaki about the way in which this mass psychology of fascism emerges is really one of the troubling questions of democratic politics. It really is. There is, the beginnings of an answer can be found in classical texts. I would draw on Max Weber's work on plebiscitary democracy, where a person emerges who is able to speak to the people over the heads of institutions. That is why a plebiscitary leader. And that such a person speaking over the heads of institutions to the people promises the people, right, that I will be the solution to the complex world that you are confronting, right? Whether it's economic crisis, whether it is political crisis, whether it's environment, you submit to me, and I will deliver the world that will give you security. This is the Weber, and I think this is exactly what we are seeing today. You see this in parts of the world that we thought would never generate a plebiscitary leader, but it is happening. It is happening in Europe. It is happening wherever people are confronting deep crisis. Weber uses the term psychic distress, a word which is ignored, but I think it's central. And when they confront that, they enter into a devotional relationship. I think, to sort of elaborate on the challenge that Janaki has raised and Chandan developed, I think in today's world, the possibility of the rise of a plebiscitary leader has become because of the emergence of new technologies of mobilization. You can speak directly to people. You can begin to manipulate the ways in which they see the world. You can exaggerate the crisis, exaggerate your own capability to deal with the crisis, etc. So this is a question that actually has to be at the center of our learning experience. I like the idea of seeing this book as suggesting, lessons. I think that is important. One of the lessons that we took away, which none of the other discussants pointed out and which I'd like to place on the table for your consideration, is the dimension of state complicity. No tyrant can impose tyranny without the complicity of the state. Yes, it may have been just a higher bureaucracy, but the last policeman in the last police station, I always use the metaphor of Tirunelveli, will still be, there's a concept of anticipatory obedience. You think this is what what the tyrant wants, and then you begin to produce outcomes which you think will please the tyrant. A lot of the empirical material on the emergency shows this in operation. It is the municipal commissioner in Delhi, Tamta, who's anticipating obedience and demolishing places, but it is also the policeman in Karnataka or in Andhra Pradesh, who is contributing to encounter killings or torture. Yesterday in Hyderabad, Shumanta Banerjee talked about the terrible torture that he experienced in jail. So, I think that aspect of state complicity, of collusion by officials, for whatever reason, and we've documented the possible reasoning which causes them to collude, is one of the important lessons of democracy. We see collusion today in democracies across the world, even by attorney generals in the United States.
So my question is to Peter. So you talked about the perilous condition of the Indian economy at that time when emergency was imposed because of the sanctions and as well as the oil shock, etc. So I just want to understand what are the decisions that the Indira Gandhi government took during that period of democracy to offset these kind of perilous economic conditions that existed in that time period. So what are these frameworks or let's say policies she came about at that point in time?
Okay, thank you. We take two more.
My question is to Peter, sir, regarding that foreign hand. Right? You mentioned Allende and Castro. What is that? Could you elaborate on what you meant by that?
And the last.
Again, to Peter de Souza, very nice insights. My question is regarding the point on the internal character of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Very fascinating that you saw it through her position, her contrasting positions as daughter of Nehru versus mother of Sanjay. I was left wondering, can a woman only be known by her relationship to men, dictator or otherwise?
So the question on the economy, the foreign hand, and
thank you for the three questions. The economic question, I'm not sure I'm the right person to be able to answer that. I think you would need to read Errol de Souza's chapter to answer that. But through a series of interventions, right? One of which is breaking the railway strike, because she really felt that the railway strike posed a great threat to the economy. And she did it in a very authoritarian manner. I mean, I'm not saying it was something good, but the railway strike was broken after 20 days. Right? She went around global capitals trying to raise, one of the suggestions was devaluation of the currency. Right? Reports suggest that by the first year of the emergency, the economic crisis is easing. Now, it's not very clear if it's because of her policies or whether there was also a good monsoon. So please look at the economic literature. I'm not the right person to give you a clear list of policy initiatives on which this. What did I mean by the foreign hand? Okay, why do I give credence to that idea? I give credence to that idea because, having tried to understand international politics over the last 40 years as a political scientist, I'm increasingly coming to believe that even democratic states, or perhaps more so democratic states, publicly democratic states, use intelligence agencies to undermine politics. They do it through fostering unrest. They do it through a misinformation campaign. They do it through infiltrating protest movements. They do it through assassination. Right? This has been documented. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm just beginning to realize that if, for example, I read, a decade and more ago, in the United Kingdom, the regime was concerned about protest movements against nuclear, the stationing of nuclear missiles in England, in Greenham Common. One of the things the intelligence agency did in such a surreptitious manner that even the regular police did not know, they infiltrated the movement and got their agents to fall in love with some of the leading activists of the movement. Right? Even marry them and even have children with them. And then disappear. So that through that, So this is how intelligence agencies work. I mean, I'm beginning to believe that there is no morality in the manner in which they think they must act to defend national interests. That's the point I wanted to make. The question of daughter of Nehru, mother of Sanjay, is I think that's an unfair question to me. Not because it ignores the fact that I talk about her spending all her time caring for her mother. The mother is a very important figure in her thing. So she's also the daughter of her mother. I mention this because these to me are relevant in the decision of the emergency. If you asked me about her as a personality, how did she negotiate her life and build a different kind of psychological profile, I would given you a different answer. Her relationship to Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. She's deeply hostile to Nayantara Sehgal, who's her first cousin. Because during the emergency, Gandhi told Indira Gandhi, go and work in the refugee camps. When the emergency, Nayantara Sehgal is critical of her. In one of the interviews that Indira Gandhi gives, she says, where was Nayantara Sehgal? In a finishing camp during the partition, meaning she was at Wellesley College. So, so I would have given you a different, and I have used these two descriptors particularly to explain the complex. I've used the, if you read the chapter, you'll see I point out to a play by Euripides about Agamemnon's dilemma, right? So I'm basically trying to explain how do you negotiate moral dilemmas? How complex is it when you have loyalties to both sides and you have to take a stand, because you cannot dither. The buck stops with you. That is why I use that. So it's not because I think a woman is defined by her relationship with men. It's because I realized that this is the negotiation she had to work through. I mean, I don't know if this is a satisfying answer, but
thank you. So I think we can take three more, a final batch of three.
This is a layman's question. I have no understanding of political science nor any scholarly claim. But this is a layman's question from having had a lived experience as a young student, 15-year-old. One wasn't tortured or anything, but beaten unconscious, admitted to the hospital with 3 broken bones, ribs. But when I look at today, I would sort of build on what Janaki mentioned. One finds it far more draconian because, I still remember emergency was something that, everybody stood against. And I still remember one said, Tana Shahi nahi chalegi. But today it's faceless. And there is a certain mass mobilized to further an authoritarian system. When we say undeclared emergency, what is undeclared emergency? And longer period for which people are being. So hence my question. The discussion, I'm going to read the book with deep interest, but the whole discussion around emergency, are these playing unwittingly into the hands of people who would want to use it to normalize what we see today?
With a hindsight, was there anything inevitable about the end of emergency? The reason for the question is that authoritarian regimes usually do not give up power voluntarily. Indira Gandhi appeared to give up power voluntarily. Did she in fact believe that she was going to win the election based on reports that she saw about the trains running on time, people showing up for work on time? That's something I've heard from my elders in the family.
So, good evening. My question is to the entire panel, but the question stemmed from the discussion that Dr. Rinku initiated. I'm trying to sort of understand that how an young Indian is framing their identity as they're growing up in this world, in the current situation, and how that eventually leads to them being an instrument in the democracy. there is a lot of institutionalized subservience. There is that I think that eventually leads to political affiliations. I feel it's a vicious cycle that inhibits mobility. And I also feel that, is it just that, or is it all institutionalized, or there is a lot of intellectual laziness that we're seeing in people these days? So I just want to understand, like, I just want your perspective on this.
Just to say that while there's so much theoretical discussion on the emergency and the administration of or governance during emergency, there is actually very little which is available on what or how the country was governed at that time. There's not very much. If you notice, that's because there's a fair amount of guesswork that's done, but there's very little which, say, the bureaucrat himself or herself has written. There's a reason for it. Bureaucrats tend to be quiet. They don't like to come out, and they're not academicians, basically, who have to teach or who have to explain a theory. But given that situation, it's about time now that if any study has to be done on the role of the bureaucracy during the emergency, this is about the last stage of those bureaucrats who will, in a few years' time, will be no more. And I think it's something that needs some amount of thinking, because when you write a book and there's so much of theoretical understanding of it or analysis of it, that it's not easy to understand what really went on. I'm sorry I gave this long thing. I'm just going to take one more minute to say this. I happened to be Assistant Commissioner in Hospit when the emergency was on. Not many people have had the good or the misfortune, whichever way you look at it, to have worked in government at that time. And why do I remember this? Because I remember it for the 20-point program type of the good side of the emergency. In Karnataka, unlike in UP, not many people were sent to jail. A couple were, in fact, there's very couple of people, but not many. So fortunately, I can skip that, but talk about this aspect of governing that happened and how it was done in the villages with the people, how Devrajas actually worked at it. I was Assistant Commissioner in Hospit, and thanks to this law which returned everything to those who had come. I'm trying to remember the act. The Debt Relief Act. Thanks, Moidi. The Debt Relief Act. We went from village to village, literally returning, and the Pawnbroking Act, literally returning goods that poor people had pawned. I remember in a place called Kampli in near Hospit, where this poor woman kept coming back at 8 in the evening when there's lights on in the village, and kept coming back because she had pawned all her things. She was a rich woman at one time. For some reason, she fell into difficult times, and she came up about 10 times that evening to take back her things. Now, that's a very emotional moment for people like us who saw that. There's so much of discussion on the wrong aspects of the emergency, which, of course, I mean, nobody can ever accept that. No doubt about it. But there are some human aspects which don't get researched, which don't get spoken about. I thought I'd just mention this as an example. This poor woman kept crying that whole evening because she got back what had illegally stayed with a pawnbroker who never gave it back. I mean, she paid back. It's not that she was taking money back, but she was unable to get her things back. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much. Please take these questions and discussions beyond the seminar room, because that is really the aspiration of the book. If we have put in so much effort into this book, That is the aspiration. Let me respond by responding to the last question. I think, thank you very much for that question about what is missing in our research. And I think that connects up with Janaki's question as well. A lot more work has to be done about what, the areas that we have not been able to cover. It's not that we did not think of it. I mean, putting together an edited volume with 16 contributions of very busy act was very difficult. And yes, there are 5 which we had commissioned which did not come in. But the point you make and that Janaki makes, that we really need to look at some aspects that were beneficial. They have been sort of briefly mentioned in Gopal Guru's paper, the idea of going to the pond, of vessels that were pawned by the very poor people being returned. That is there, and in fact, that he actually personally experienced it. So we have signaled that, but certainly more research needs to be done on that question. On the question of normalizing, will our book run the risk of normalizing it? I think as academics, that's a risk. You see, I don't think many years ago when I was a student, and this is a question that an academic always confronts, that when I present a certain information into the public domain, there's always a risk that somebody will take it and misuse it. I was told, don't play God, right? I think our aim to protect against that is to actually generate a robust public debate. And we had that, as Janaki mentions, and Chandan mentions, even during the emergency, it was there. There may be greater silence today. And hopefully our book will raise these awkward questions that today are not being raised. And therefore, I mean, if it gets, I don't think our book is too complex for anyone to be able to use it to justify what is happening. The issue of ending it, I've given an answer. The conventional answer is the one you've given, that, the intelligence agency said you're going to win the election. I mean, as I said, you have to ask the two questions together, right? Why did she impose it in 1975? Why not in 1971 if she had an autocratic tendency, right? Why didn't, elections were due anyway. So why did she impose it? Why did she lift it? And I've tried to give an answer which tries to understand the decision frame of a prime minister. Now, people have attributed it as, if she goes for election now, she will win the elections. Some of the biographies that I have read actually shows her actually thinking she's going to lose. She actually felt that she was going to lose because when the information coming from her bureaucrats about the excesses of the emergency, the atrocities of the emergency, troubled her so much that if it was only a pragmatic decision of winning an election, she would have consulted her party. They were taken by surprise. They were not prepared for the decision. So let's talk about it. Let's research much more. I may be wrong, but I think we need to now begin to excavate. That's all I can say to you. I've given one answer. You're giving another. Let's debate it. Okay, you're giving us your suggestion. Okay.
Thank you very much. All good things come to an end, and so is this session.
All good things come to an end.
Yes.
Aren't we resisting this right now? Good things should stay on. The bad things should come to an end.
That's a very good lesson from this emerger. It's a lesson for democracy. Thank you, Chandan. And so please, before you leave, give a big hand to our panelists. Thank you.